Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it may be for you right now. This is your professor, Professor Barry, and today, the focus is really providing information about this idea of the social construction of race. And to get there, we need to talk about biological ideas of race. We need to trace back through time. So it's going to be a lot, some historical information, kind of pulling from the past, pulling from the present to try to understand this issue of like, what is race? How do we think about race? What are some of the complicating factors around definitions of race? In general, so in general, how we define things is arbitrary. Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let me kind of go to the PowerPoint, and I can kind of like walk through this sort of idea of the social construction of race. I think this first slide here, see this title of this article. It's a really good short article if you're interested in reading it. Race is real in the sense that we see it as real, but it's not real because it's biologically real or genetically real. It's real because we as humans have created this concept of race. Here's another way of saying it. Race as we know it has no deterministic, no biological basis. All the same, race is powerful, can have life or death consequences because that's how we see the world, right? And it's how we develop institutions based on some of those perceptions of the world. It's how we treat each other in terms of that idea, this idea of race. So give you an example of, the life or death consequences at maybe a kind of group level to all the way to an institutional level. African-Americans tend to have high blood pressure, hypertension. And that's a lot of environmental things that are going on that are shaping that. A lot of stuff that goes back in terms of individual interactions and social interactions, discrimination, reactions from people in the community, both in terms of real discrimination within institutions, the microaggressions, the everyday kind of stuff that happens to individuals, like that stuff, creates environments where hypertension is more likely to happen. So it has real consequences, right? Physiological consequences, all the way to institutional consequences as well. So if we have this idea about race, and sometimes we structure institutions in ways that are a reflection of those ideas about race. To kind of get us started too, here's just a couple different examples, like, thinking about the United States, we have a very particular conception of race. Every nation has its own way of sort of going about sort of working with ideas about race. In the United States, we talk about sort of this idea of the one drop rule. That one drop of African descent leads to identifying an individual as being Black, African-American. It's this sort of one drop kind of conception. Very American in terms of orientation, where other countries, there may be more of a color gradient or not quite a strong pull between sort of this sort of black and white kind of divide. So give you a couple different examples. Colin Powell has Dutch ancestry as well as African ancestry. So he's referred to and maybe even self-identify as an African American, but his genealogy is more complicated. Ted Cruz, Hispanic, Latinx, as well as Caucasian. But see him in terms of being white in this case. It's like, so kind of going these two different directions there, kind of interesting. And then Tiger Woods, I'll show you this real quick video, which I think kind of gets at it. This interview that he had with Oprah Winfrey on the Oprah Winfrey Show. Hold on one second there. Let's see, let me kind of back out of here. All right, here we go.
Last week, Tiger Woods told me that he had made a name for himself when he was a child. And let me emphasize, a lot of people just took it out of context. He said when he was growing up, it was a child's effort to define who he was. Pay attention to what he says. Can we get this straight? What do you call yourself? Do you call yourself African American? I know you are. Your father's half black, quarter Chinese, quarter American Indian, mother's half Thai, quarter Chinese, and quarter white. So you are. That's why you America's son.
Yeah.
You are America's son.
Well, funny thing is, growing up, I came up with this name. I'm a Combination.
A Combination.
Caucasian, blue, black, Indian, Asian. Combination.
That's what you call yourself?
Yeah.
Okay, he does not say he calls himself that now. He said that he called himself that as a child. He was little. Here's what he did say, because I realized he was getting himself in a lot of trouble. So I went back and asked him the question again. I realized he was in more trouble than he knew when he said it. I asked him about how he sees himself now, and this is what he said.
What matters
when you're
is,
called one or the other, does it bother you to be called African American?
Yeah, it does, because to be honest with you, if I would have to label myself as anything, ethnic-wise, I always had to check a box, in those little forms and stuff. And they say pick one. I can't. I usually pick African American, Asian, because those are the two households I was raised under.
So you don't want to deny your mother's heritage?
I'm
and
not going to
household.
deny my mom's heritage. I'm not going to deny my father's heritage. Those are the two I was raised under, and those are the only two things I know.
Although he may call himself Combination. When people see him, they see a black face. They see a black man. How did you raise him to believe that he was of what race and belonged to what race?
The human race.
The human race.
Okay, yeah, so Tiger Woods sort of wrestling with or figuring out sort of self-definition, his own racial identity. And as a kid growing up, it's like trying to identify the different aspects in terms of his own genealogy, his own heritage, but also sort of understanding that in the world that he lives in, that there's that this idea of blackness, right, of being African American, like that's what stands out, called kind of a master status. And his father says, we raised him to be a member of the human race. I mean, this kind of leads us into sort of a different little bit of a discussion, but I think that, it's interesting, the negotiation of these ideas of identity and racial identity. In one sense, it's a great thing, right? To see ourselves as being a part of a larger human race, the connectivity that we have in terms of us being humans. And we can hold on to that idea individually, but society doesn't work that way. And individuals within society don't always work that way. Like we do see color, we do see difference. So it's how we navigate that particular space. So that's kind of like that's kind of where we're going in this kind of discussion. So where to start with those, we have to start with this idea of defining terminology. The first terminology is the social construction of reality. Before we get to race, just thinking about how do we construct meaning. This was a book written in the 1960s, Berger and Luckman, that really provided a framework of thinking about how humans create meaning. And how that meaning that we create interpersonally leads to the way that meaning is embedded in institutions and in social life. It gets reinforced in institutions and social life, and it becomes almost taken for granted, right? So that becomes normalized, this sort of ways of thinking and knowing. And what Berger and Luckman identifies, that constructs, kind of ways of organizing the world, these are human creations. They're not real in terms of the objective empirical reality. They're constructions that we make. They're meaning that we give things. And we view the world through these constructs, right? Think about other areas besides race, gender as a construct, sexual orientation as a construct. Like we organize the world in very particular ways, and we've constructed meaning based on these different constructs. Sometimes these constructs, oftentimes they get really stabilized, and they get more and more stable or entrenched or embedded in society because they become more accepted, more shared, less aware about their constructed nature. It just becomes normalized or taken for granted. I mean, during the time period when we talk about biological notions of race, to try to put yourself back there in that time period, people that lived in the 1800s, early 1900s, all the way to the 1960s, really saw race as a biological thing. You know, that was sort of the taken for granted world. I mean, that's the way that people, institutions saw the world. And that world has been deconstructed now. So we constructed a world based on, you know, this biological notion of race. And then starting in the 1960s and 70s, started to deconstruct or ask questions about how this biological idea of race started to identify the problems with that notion of biological ideas of race. Now we're reconstructing ideas about race. How we build ideas is based on language, based on our discourse, the way that we engage in the social world in that regard. It's based on our everyday habits, what we do. We reinforce particular ideas about whatever it might be. And then meanings eventually become, as I mentioned, become institutionalized, become viewed as reality, objective reality, you know, just the way things are, for example. I think I maybe have mentioned in the last video, but a book I read recently, the history of sex, or A Curious History of Sex. I mean, a lot of stuff about social construction stuff going on within that, within this book, looking at the male body, the female body, ideas of sexuality, and it's just really fascinating to kind of pull back on the history of understanding about sexuality. And from historical distance, we look back in the past and go, wow, that was really strange that people were doing so and so, or believed such and such. And so we got to be thinking that some of that's still going on today, right? I mean, we're part of culture and time, and ideas move. Anyway, meaning is arbitrary, but it's real. So that idea that it has real consequences, right? So race is real in the sense that we believe it to be real, but it's not real in the sense of biologically or genetically real. And this is the idea in sociology, W.I. Thomas, the Thomas theorem. If you define it as real, it's real in its consequences. So the issue that Thomas raised in the Thomas theorem is that it's all about definition. If people define it a certain way, then they believe it to be true, right? Thinking about, there's been, you know, a history of thinking about sexuality and race, sexuality so blackness and sexuality, Asianness and Asian Americans and sexuality, going back to the 1800s and 1900s. I mean, these are powerful constructs that have real consequences. We start thinking about the ways in which different groups have been categorized, viewed, for sure. So race is, wait, it's like, oh, wait, race is a social construct, but it is real. While ideas of race are created by humans, arbitrary, it doesn't mean they don't exist in our perceptions, right? So it's all about our perceptions, our attitudes, our behavior. Again, the Thomas theorem sort of idea. I mean, humans categorize, humans label. How we label, why we label are the questions to ask. Like how, why, what are the ways in which we're labeling, and then what are the consequences? Those are important kind of things. This is a really interesting book. Isabel Wilkerson, came out maybe last year, year before. There's some great podcasts. Ezra Klein show. Ezra Klein does a lot of great interviews with authors. If you're interested, a good 45-minute interview with her talking about America as a caste system, both race and class sort of operating. So there's sort of the way she talks about caste. I thought it's really provocative and informative. And what I extracted here is a quote from, after a talk one time, somebody came up to her and said, you know, there are no Black people in Africa. And, you know, Isabel Wilkerson says, you know, most Americans weaned on the myth of drawable lines between human beings have to sit with that statement for a while. It sounds nonsensical to our ears. Of course, there are Black people in Africa. There's a whole continent of Black people in Africa. How could anyone not see that? And the person who came up to her said, Africans are not Black. They are Igbo and Yoruba and different communities within Africa. They are not Black. They become Black when they immigrate to the United States or immigrate to England or different places around the world to have this idea about Blackness. So that kind of gets to that social construction, that arbitrary nature of race, that individuals in Africa are not going to see themselves as necessarily being Black. that those categories and that language is what we're kind of after. A couple other good books. I mean, you're going to read an excerpt from this author here, Hanny Lopez, from the larger book, White by Law, sort of how legal definitions about race provide a historical perspective. And then this one, Nell Irvin Painter, The History of White People, is a great examination of biological ideas of race, the rise of science and ideas about race. For any of this stuff, you can look around. Look for interviews with these authors. If you don't want to read the whole book, if you're interested in the topic, there's a lot of great resources out there. Look for, usually when somebody writes a book, they go on speaking tour. And so you can actually hear them talk about their work, and it's accessible without having to read all of their work. And then finally, sort of this, I've just pulled this forward, like the US Census, recently, I can't remember what year, but basically says, they're collecting information on race and for a reason. Okay, so this becomes, we'll talk about a little bit later on about colorblind racism and how colorblindness is actually problematic. We need to identify what's going on in terms of the different experiences of different groups. So we know patterns of behavior, for example, patterns regarding health, access to healthcare, education, educational outcomes, all these different kind of things that we need to keep track in order to be able to understand the different experiences of different groups, right? So there's value in identifying value in identifying race because that's how the world is structured in a way. But the US Census Bureau realizes that the questions they ask about race is not an attempt to define race biologically, anthropologically, or genetically. It's recognized the categories of race, including national origin, are social cultural groups. So this recognition, right? And that's, the recognition that the US Census, it's become more commonly accepted today that race is not it's not designed by biology, but it's a human concept. Okay, let's get into the biological idea about race. You can read here this little excerpt, or from a larger book back in probably the 1800s. At the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races, varieties of man, each with different instincts, customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originated in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. So you can already see, this biological conceptions of race are putting and elevating Caucasians as the highest race, as the best race, as the most civilized race. I mean, we're getting into already how race is going to be used as a tool to justify exploitation and subjugation of those who are not a member of the dominant race. Okay, so let's kind of go through a little bit about some brief historical kind of capturing of biological ideas of race. So when did biological ideas of race start? Well, it started with the Enlightenment, with the rise and development of science. Prior to the Enlightenment, biological categories of race did not exist. So ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, they did not have biological categories of race. Now there was ways of thinking and ways of organizing that they organized their world. They identified difference between different groups based on religion, based on region, based on area, based on customs and practices. So it wasn't that everyone was treated as being a member of the same community. I mean, there was division and separation, but they didn't have this idea of a biological concept of race. And that's what's new and different starting with the Enlightenment. So prior to the Middle Ages or before, religion and language, physical markers in terms of color of one's skin and physical features were not part of that categorization. So it was really the development of science. And with the development of science was also coinciding with exploration from exploration and colonization of different countries. So it's exploration, encountering different groups and different people from the West, from the West, from the Western Europe, encountering people from other places around the world for really not necessarily for the first time, but at this level, in this way, and with the goal of colonization, of taking control over land and people. So this idea of biological race became a way to justify, justify these kind of the colonization of a group of people, bringing civilization, right? Some sort of justification for subjugating groups of people. Here's some, so different scientists who are advancing this idea of biological race. Some of them have some differences in terms of the categories themselves, but they're basically all generally the same. But here's another system of categorization. These 4 different categories here. This is a kind of a depiction from a book in 1854, and you can see there's a sort of we call it scientific racism. That science was reflecting the racism of the day and reinforcing racism, equating those of African descent of being closer to the primate world, put Darwin's perspective on this, that less evolutionary, not developed, an evolutionary throwback, that individuals of Caucasian race have been evolutionarily advanced. Like these kind of, we see it today as sort of recognize, wow, this is like really race specific and racist kind of notions and ideas. And these were embedded in science. And this was like the common way of thinking for a lot of individuals at that particular time. This depiction is really interesting to me. We got a hierarchy going on here. Kind of pay attention to here a little bit. Look at the face, the direction of the skull, right? And then look at what's actually depicted here. So we see a distortion going on here where here it's like side to side and here's person's facing like almost a 45-degree angle, same here. The jawbone and doesn't even match, right? It's not even close. I mean, and this one here, it's resting on the mandible, resting on the jawbone. These are resting in different place, or this one's resting in a different place. This one's looking up to the heavens. This one, I mean, there's these things that are going on there. And this is that sort of Greek Roman kind of archetype that's being represented here. Evolutionary, this is an evolutionary sort of idea. Evolutionary, the higher the level of the species. This interesting work, Stephen Jay Gould in The Mismeasure of Man, a fabulous, interesting read about scientific racism, not only with race, but also with gender and class. The rise and development of the IQ with Stanford Binet, of like why, developing an IQ test and how the IQ test was used in ways to demean and devalue people of certain social groups and classes. I mean, interesting kind of stuff that was going on. And what Gould's argument is that depictions like this were not intentional by those who designed it. That they weren't, in their own mind, weren't intentionally trying to fabricate or misrepresent the skull and the actual, the actual physical feature here. But it was just part of their way of thinking, and they were depicting what they were thinking, sort of this reinforcing in an unintentional way. Hold on one second. Where I left off. So yeah, Stephen Jay Gould, the sort of idea of mismeasure of man. And then we get sort of this, just one more example thinking about sort of distorted ideas about race. This is someone from Ireland, so the Black Irish during that particular time period. I mean, this was not, these biological conceptions of race were extended beyond what we think about in terms of maybe Africa, those of African descent or Asian or the Middle East. I mean, it's even Germans and the Irish, different particular time periods. So biological concepts of race were powerful back then, and they are powerful even today, although I think we've moved some distance, but some people are still hanging on to this sort of idea of biological race. Native Americans, I mean, sort of another application thinking about biological ideas about race, this idea of needing to civilize the savage. I mean, that's sort of deeply rooted in terms of the colonization project in the United States. And this is a History Channel article, but basically, just sort of that just gave the idea of savagery gave justification for, you know, movement west and the either the genocide, the extermination, the movement west, the treatment of Native Americans, the indigenous communities in the United States, in America, you know, is based on this sort of these biological conceptions. The book The Bell Curve came out in the 1980s, and two researchers arguing the sort of connection between genetics, intelligence, and basically life outcomes. Very controversial, for sure. I mean, I think the general thought, at least in the realm of sociology, is that Herrnstein and Murray are it's faulty science. It's contemporary scientific racism. They are misrepresenting. The data that they're presenting is reinforcing a particular viewpoint, that they are not looking at other factors that are shaping outcomes for different groups of people, but they're trying to put it in this sort of genetic place. So these ideas were powerful in the past, and they're still part of life today. Okay, so let's get to scientific racism, contradictions of like, why is this idea of biological race false? It's fascinating to go back. I mean, the categories, we don't even use things today. Maybe people have heard the category of someone who's mulatto, somebody who's mixed. Like that term may be heard in the South, maybe Louisiana, Mississippi, maybe even today hear that term. But for large part, it's not part of our language anymore. An octoroon. I mean, there was actually a category back 1800s, this idea of somebody's 1/8 of African descent. They were an octoroon. There are categories all the way up to like 1/32nd, 1/64th. This is that one drop rule kind of notion. This is an interesting case of Susie Gilroy Phipps in the 1980s. She went to apply for, I don't know if it was a visa or a passport to travel outside the country. She needed to provide information on her birth certificate. So she got her birth certificate, and on her birth certificate, it said something about, it identified her race as being either colored or Black. I think it was probably colored during that time period. Anyway, she always saw herself as white, raised in a white family, a white community. I mean, she had self-identified as white. So she went to the court and asked the court to change her racial designation on her birth certificate. I mean, this is 1980s, okay, that this happened. She was 1/32nd in terms of looking at her genealogy, 1/32nd of African descent. As her great grandmother was a Black woman who was a slave. She sued the state of Louisiana to change from colored to white, and the court denied her motion. So one, why are they 1/32nd? I mean, that's pretty arbitrary, right? Like what's going on there? That's very illogical. It's built on an idea of science being used, or this idea of biology is deeply entrenched in society, right? And the legal system's reinforcing these ideas, right? And they become established, become common practice, ways of thinking and knowing and doing that are contradictory or illogical. Another interesting one, okay, so this idea of passing, and this, to put it in a historical context, 1950s, gaining development of the civil rights movement, movement of African Americans out of the South, moving up to the northern cities during times of World War II, so going back to the 1940s, 1950s. There's greater consumption, and this is important in terms of things like culture and the arts. So music, for example, think about Elvis and his gyrating pelvis, Elvis the pelvis. So whites are kind of appropriating, engaging in Black music forms. There becomes fear among some that individuals about racial mixing, this idea of sort of mixing of the races. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And there was a fear of passing that. What would happen if a person could pass as white, that they may not even know that they are 1/32nd of African descent or whatever it may be, or maybe they do know, but they can pass as white because there's privilege and advantage of being able to pass, right? So an individual may be able to pass, and William Francis White, two different examples here, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, organization, and it got started by W. Du Bois and a few others back in the early 1900s. Lena Horne, an actress, both could pass as white. And what would happen? It's no kidding you, a public fear of what's going on, of what would happen if an individual could pass as white, an individual was able to, they got romantically involved in somebody else of the white race, and they had kids. What would happen? So it's fear of passing, that kind of thing. So the film Pinky is a demonstration or an illustration of this idea. The film Pinky, this is a mother and daughter. The mother leaves the South. They grow up, she grows up in the South. She leaves the South, goes up north, trains as a nurse, falls in love with someone who's white, comes back home. In this film, they actually kiss. They kiss, the boyfriend girlfriend kiss in the movie. The film is banned in Marshall, Texas. It's taken to the state Supreme Court of whether or not the city of Marshall can ban this film, the showing of the film, because the film is viewed as being provocative in showing a white person and a person of color or a Black person kissing on the screen. The reality too was that both actors were self-identified as white, and the filmmaker specifically cast 2 white people to play these roles because they knew the fear and the climate of that particular time period. This is the Carnegie Institute, and the Carnegie Institute trying to alleviate the public's fears about this idea of passing. Here on this sort of chart, you have a white man, white woman. Here they have 4 kids. And here you have a white man, a woman, mulatto, white person, it's that half white, half Black sort of notion. And then you have boy Black, boy girl, half Black, boy half Black, girl pass for white. These 2 get together, have a kid, and they have a white baby, trying to alleviate the public concern. Think about, just look at this for a moment. Think about the distortions that are going on here. Very feminine, very masculine. The physical depiction of these individuals. Boy Black, white boy, even the language is not consistent. There's so many things that are going on here. This idea, these mutton chops, the working class, there's a class issue going on here of what's going on. So again, this is about humans creating these kind of constructions and ideas that are fundamentally problematic. Another example of the illogical of these ideas about race and why there can be a problem too is like thinking about Asians as the model minority, right? So all Asians therefore become the same. We categorize, if we categorize Asian Americans as one sort of uniform category, there's a lot of variability, all these different ethnic groups and their experiences, right? So part of it depends on, a group's experience, like when they immigrated to the United States. Was it because were they refugees coming out of war? So thinking about Cambodia, thinking about Vietnam, thinking about different countries and different experiences. What time period did people immigrate to the United States? What was their social class background when they immigrated to the United States? Like all those things matter. But in America, we have this sort of conception about sort of Asian Americans being the model minority. And when we do that, we fail to recognize the diversity of experiences underneath that umbrella of the Asian American. Okay, so the 4th theme are consequences. Okay, so if we organize the world along these sort of biological dimensions of race, we get to certain consequences. And one of them is this idea that if we mix the races, that it could lead to the destruction of society itself, and destruction of whiteness, of white purity. This is very much, we think about Hitler, we think about, the idea of eugenics. And these were ideas that are born in the United States, as well as scientists in England as well. But these ideas really took hold in the United States. Miscegenation is the mixing of races. There was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 forbidding individuals, white and Negro, to have contact with one another. You can look up the Mann Act, M-A-N-N. It was illegal to take someone of color across, a Black person across state lines. Chuck Berry the musician, actually got charged for violating the Mann Act and served time in prison for violating the Mann Act, taking a white woman across state lines. It wasn't until 1967, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, that there was a ban on prohibiting interracial marriages. So, I mean, that was deep in orientation, or deep in terms of institutionalized, taken for granted world, right? That was the world people constructed. They believed it. They believed in this sort of idea of keeping the races apart, keeping them separate. And that's the way society was organized. So Ideas of Eugenics, this is a really powerful book, War Against the Weak by Edwin Black, really great account of the rise and development of eugenics. And Cold Spring Harbor in New Jersey was a center point in terms of research and development of the ideas of eugenics. Like I said before, we think of that as sort of Nazi Germany. These ideas, are rooted in the United States. Scientists in the United States developing these ideas of eugenics, you meaning good, and genetics meaning good genes, right? So good genes, and promoting good genes in society, that we could create a stronger society, a more fit society, by controlling the genetic composition of society itself. That led to things like sterilizations of Native Americans, of women of color, of individuals who are identified as being having developmental problems or developmental issues, that people were being involuntarily sterilized. And this was not only in the United States. This is Australia, this idea of you could integrate whiteness into an Aboriginal. They believed that after 3 generations, you could manifest a white person, somebody who's white, by intermixing an Aboriginal with a white person. And this is a powerful film called Rabbit Proof Fence, where these kids in a family were basically trying to avoid being captured by the dominant group and put into basically like a boarding school and going through this process. So they wanted to be, it's them of escaping and their travel to go back to their community. So really powerful film. But I wanted to bring that forward to say it's not only the United States, but other countries were working, of course, these ideas of eugenics as well. Another consequence is it justifies discrimination at an institutional level. This was from the state of Louisiana, a literacy test, that for people to be able to vote, they had to pass this test. This was given to African Americans. If you look through these kind of things here, it's like, why this idea of this literacy test? It was a way to basically disenfranchise Black people from voting. And it was built on this idea of biological it was built on ideas of biological race originally, and it just became more and more institutionalized. And then it led to different practices, this idea of institutional discrimination. And we still have issues with that today. Scapegoating theory, I want to bring this idea up. Again, it's sort of another consequence, is that when we put it like these biological races, sometimes we use that as a scapegoat. We identify the problem within society. If there's an economic problem or a social problem, we don't deal with the root of the problem, but rather a group gets blamed for the problem itself, right? So we could look at immigration history. I don't mean to bring this up and to be provocative in terms of Trump specifically, but rather this longer narrative in American history of, we can go back to 1800s, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first act that we have to prohibit the immigration of a particular group of people to come to the United States. And there was a fear that the Chinese were too industrious, they're going to take over the United States. They're devouring Uncle Sam, both the Irish and the Black Irish. This is the depiction of the Irish. So there was economic recessions going on at that particular time period. There was movement development. There's issues that were going on, that the problem of what was going on wasn't the immigrant labor. The problem was a lot of other things that are going on in society. But what happens is we focus on sometimes a particular group, or a group gets focused on, they get blamed for the particular problem, right? They're a member of a different race, a different group. They become a target for scapegoating. A couple other things here too is maybe another thing to think about. This is a really interesting book, There Goes My Everything, written about basically interviewing and chatting with white Southerners that were experiencing the civil rights era, 1940s, 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So I guess I bring this up in terms of society is shifting, 1950s, right? Desegregation, 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. It took until last year where the Mississippi state flag finally removed symbols of Confederacy from the state flag. Ideas of race deeply entrenched in culture in our nation, and regionally super powerful. Go to the South, and you have different ideas of race. Okay, so let's go to the theme 5. Just got this one and one more. Ideas of colorblind racism, I think less common today, but in the 1980s and 1990s is fairly common to hear, I don't see race, I just see people. We're all a member of the human race. This kind of idea. Well, it's colorblind. We talk about it as colorblind racism. This idea of being colorblind is actually, it's actually reinforcing, and it's built upon ideas of racist ideas. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, a provocative book, Racism Without Racist People, he kind of investigates this idea of colorblind racism. So it's a great quote to kind of get at it. How do whites explain the contradiction between being colorblind and the way that actually race is structured in society itself? I contend that whites have developed a powerful explanation and justification for racial inequality that basically removes any responsibility for them for the status of people of color. And he talks about this is colorblind racism. I don't see color, I just see people. It's impossible not to see color. There's an interesting study, a real quick segue, an interesting study of someone who grew up visually impaired. Blind, was not able to see, right? And even that individual saw color. Saw it, not necessarily to visually see it, but knew the codes by interacting in the world, language patterns, comments that people would make when this person interacted with people from different groups. Like they started to learn ideas about race, even though they visually never saw race. And this is really a powerful testament that even in the case for not being able to see, people still develop ideas about race. So yeah, we see visual cues. We cannot do that. I thought this was, I was looking up different things the other day. I don't see color, but people tell me I'm white. Well, I would say that if somebody's wearing that shirt, a white person wearing that shirt, they never saw themselves as being white. It doesn't mean that they don't have an identity built around whiteness. For them, it may be invisible. They may not recognize it, but they have an identity built around whiteness. And this is going to be part of the class we kind of talk about when we get into that section of the class about understanding whiteness is different than understanding identities around people of color. People of color are more cognizant and aware of their racial status. The dominant group, less so. And that's just because of where a person and their social group is situated in the social order. In the 1990s, Proposition 54 in California, this idea of the colorblind initiative that the government's no longer kind of going to keep track of data and information of race, the race of applicants to schools and education for anything to do with the government. Well, problematic. If we don't collect data, we are not going to find out and identify if there are patterns of inequality going on. That proposition was forwarded by a group that was really trying to reinforce their privilege and advantage in society. You can look into Proposition 54 if you're interested, the Racial Privacy Initiative. It sounds really good in theory, but the problem is if we're denying the existence of the way that we structure and see race, we're gonna get to a place where we're not going to be able to identify where those inequities exist. And you can kind of see this idea about being colorblind, all lives matter, just like this sort of idea of response to Black Lives Matter. Affirmative action is a negative reaction, only racists consider race. Affirmative action is intended to deal with racial inequity, historical, long, deeply entrenched historical inequity. It's not a negative reaction, it's proactive. But if, a person, this idea this is what's trying to argue that we all should be treated equal, and we should, but we're not there. So we got to figure out ways of structuring, addressing the inequities within society itself. So here's a couple quotes from him. Racism springs not from the heart of racists, but from the fact that dominant actors in a racialized system receive benefit at all levels. So it's not necessarily the individual level. He's getting at the structural level, the cultural level. Racial outcomes are not the result of individuals, but of practices, things that are at the structural level. Our contemporary ways of thinking about race are sometimes much more covert. People speak in coded terms. They avoid talking about maybe about race. I think now is different. Like I said, this idea of colorblind racism was really powerful 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. I think it's still there to some extent, for sure, but we're much more engaged in conversations of race. And then finally, links to the matrix of domination, and we'll talk more about this in class. But thinking about epistemology, ways of knowing, right? So ways of knowing and understand ways of knowing, social construction of reality are really powerful and important. We need to understand how we're developing ways of thinking and knowing. And we need to be able to critique the empirical, but also sometimes lean into the empirical. We need data to be able to identify things that are going on. But we need to also understand the experiences of different groups, right? To hear the stories, to the idea of rationalism, hearing stories and perspectives helps us to better understand what's going on in the social world. Also, the idea that the matrix of domination is that that researchers need to be praxis oriented. And by praxis, meaning taking theory and moving it towards social change. Like there's actually an intent behind research is to address inequities and move towards greater social change, and really fulfilling the promise of democratic principles and ideals. So the matrix is trying to address historical context and looking at the 4 different domains of power. The structural level, thinking about laws and institutions. Disciplinary, right? Could be like, the disciplinary, the ways in which we regulate and control, all the way from the informal, our networks, all the way to institutions that are regulating and controlling. So think about eugenics, instituted in structural level, policies and practices, disciplinary, interpretive, fitting into a cultural framework and way of knowing, and then we carry them out in our daily lives in terms of interpersonal. You can read over this. We can talk more about it in class, this idea of the hegemonic view. This is the dominant view of race, right? That biological notion of race. And this is sort of the matrix would say that hegemonic view helps to reinforce that system of privilege and disadvantage. If you're interested, there's a project called the Whiteness Project, interviews with different individuals who are white to talk about their experience of being white. Really interesting conversation going on there. And then Simon Tam talking about his interview with a white supremacist. I thought it was an interesting interview. And then Brian Stevenson, who's just got a really powerful perspective, and he's talking about specifically injustice in the criminal justice system. All right, that's it for now. Yeah, bring questions forward if you have them, and if you're in class, look forward to our class conversation. Have a great day, and we'll catch you next time.